Bueno, pasamos ya cerca de Holmes y nos vamos a Londres ya definitivamente. Y yo lo que quería comentaros, os voy a presentar unos cuantos sitios. Todas estas fotos son fotos que yo he ido haciendo en los viajes que he hecho a Londres. Y os voy a retar a ver si sois capaces de decirme qué sitios son. Esta casi no os reto porque está muy claro, ¿no? Es el museo de Sherlock Holmes, que está en Baker Street, en el 221B. Realmente no está en el 221B, pero bueno, lo han forzado un poco para que encaje. Pero bueno, ahí tenéis una reproducción de la casa victoriana de Sherlock Holmes muy bonita, y tenéis una tienda también que está muy bien, de artículos de Sherlock Holmes, etcétera, y todo el mundo. Cuando yo fui la primera vez no había prácticamente nadie, y ahora con las películas de Robert Downey y la serie de la ABC, pues ahora hay que hacer cola para entrar. Pero bueno, yo creo que en todos los viajes que he hecho a Londres, que he ido un montón de veces, es el punto al que he ido todas las veces, porque siempre voy, aunque sea, a dar una vuelta por la tienda. Este segundo sitio, a ver quién lo conoce. Levante la mano. Este es más difícil, pero para mí es casi tan importante o tan interesante como el otro. Este es el Sherlock Holmes Pub. Es un pub que está en el centro de Londres, de hecho incluso más céntrico que el otro, que el museo, que prácticamente es un museo también, porque está lleno de objetos, de cosas vinculadas a Sherlock Holmes. Tiene 2 plantas, de hecho se dice, o ellos defienden, que el lugar donde el perro Baskerville se pierde la bota es ese sitio, que eso era el hotel. Pero bueno, ahora Alistair hablará un poco de eso. Este sitio está chulísimo porque además tiene una reproducción del escritorio de Sherlock Holmes que estuvo en el Festival de Bretaña, y puedes comer al lado del escritorio. O sea, está muy pero muy bien. Y de hecho, a mí es donde más me gusta ir, con amigos o solo, cuando estoy dando vueltas, siempre termino ahí a tomarme una pinta de sidra o incluso a cenar. Es un sitio que está muy bien. Este sitio sí lo conoceréis. Sobre todo si habéis visto el museo de Sherlock Holmes, pues esto está muy cerca. Esta es una estatua que está en Baker Street, bueno, en Baker Street exactamente no, está en la parada del metro de Baker Street, pero no está en Baker Street, sino que está en otra calle, está al lado de Madame Tussauds. Y es una estatua de Sherlock Holmes, pues que es otra referencia en Londres para todos los fans. Este a lo mejor lo habéis visto, bueno, lo habéis visto seguro, porque también estaba súper céntrico. Esto es la estación de tren de Charing Cross, que tiene ese monumento delante. La estación de tren de Charing Cross está conectada con Sherlock Holmes porque aparecen muchísimos relatos. De hecho, el libro Cerca de Holmes habla de todas las estaciones de tren y todas las conexiones. Pero en concreto ese monumento que está ahí tiene mucho que ver con nosotros, con los españoles, porque es un monumento en honor a una reina de Castilla que fue reina de Inglaterra. Y no os digo más porque en el libro está explicado, ¿vale? Pero está muy interesante. Este sitio no está en el libro porque el libro se escribió en 2007, pero lo conocéis, ¿no? Este es el Speedies de la serie Sherlock. Y ahora mismo pues se ha convertido en un lugar donde van pues todos los días montones de fans y es prácticamente imposible entrar. Es tan chiquitín y va tanta gente que tomarse algo ahí es prácticamente imposible. Yo a las veces que he entrado he sido con apretujones y he salido rápido, y lo han convertido casi en un pequeño museo porque ahora está lleno de fotos de la serie y cosas. Y por supuesto arriba se supone que es donde está el 229 ahora. No está en Baker Street, está en North Gower Street. Este sitio es el 12 de Tennyson Road. Es una antigua casa de Conan Doyle, igual que Anderson. Hasta hace unos años era roja, que era como era en tiempos de Conan Doyle, pero la pintaron de ese color tan horrible. Y bueno, ahí a la derecha se puede ver la inscripción que todavía está. Por dentro no tiene ya nada que ver con lo que era la casa. Este sitio es difícil de reconocer, pero está muy céntrico. Este es el Colegio de Cirujanos de Londres. Y dentro tiene el Museo Hunteriano. No sé si habéis oído hablar de él o si habéis estado. Es un sitio donde tienes que ir antes de comer, porque como vayas después, desde luego puedes acabar vomitando. Es el museo más... no sé cómo decirlo, que he visto nunca. Está lleno de piezas de medicina, pues de fetos, de tumores, de amputaciones, de cosas, ¿no? De los médicos que las tienen ahí, de un tipo que se llamaba Hunter, que fue el que empezó a hacer la colección, y ahí se ha quedado y sigue creciendo. Este sitio es el Palacio de Cristal. Es un sitio que recuerda mucho a nuestro Parque de Retiro de Madrid, por ejemplo, pero no lo conoce casi nadie a nivel turístico porque está en la zona sureste de Londres. Está en la zona de Northwood, Croydon, toda esa zona. Y es un sitio muy bonito, tuvo un palacio de cristal, como dice, al estilo del que hay en el Parque de Retiro, que fue parte de una exposición universal. Tiene esa torre de comunicaciones, tiene un estadio de fútbol dentro donde juega un equipo de la Premier League, el Crystal Palace. Tiene unos estanques con dinosaurios a tamaño natural, muy chulos, y tiene conexiones también con Conan Doyle, sobre todo, que están explicadas en el libro. Este reloj tan bonito está en ese barrio también, cerca de allí, pero tampoco tiene nada de turístico, nadie conoce esto. En el libro veréis la historia de este reloj que tiene que ver con Conan Doyle, sobre todo. Cerca de Holmes realmente es el libro que he traducido y que es de Alistair Duncan. Es un repaso a los vínculos entre el Londres histórico, Sherlock Holmes y Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Es una guía sherlockiana y estuvo nominado al premio Tony and Freda Howlett Award. Alistair Duncan, que es su autor, es un fan de Sherlock desde hace más de 30 años. Ahora mismo es vocal de la junta directiva de la Sociedad Sherlock Holmes de Londres. Pertenece al Arthur Conan Doyle Establishment de Crowborough, también a los Sydney Passengers. Ganó en el 2011 el Tony Freda Howlett Award por El autor de Norwood, un libro sobre Conan Doyle también. Nominado para el Carol Dukes Montpellier Award por el artículo El sabueso de Daffodils. Y es autor de otro libro también muy interesante que se llama Eliminar lo imposible. Es un autor sherlockiano total. Ahí tenéis la dirección de su blog si queréis ver los artículos. Hoy, por ejemplo, ha publicado que ha recibido las copias ya en español del libro. Y ahí tenéis también su Twitter si queréis seguirlo. Alistair nos ha mandado una entrevista explicándonos, respondiéndonos a unas 9 preguntas que explican bastante bien de qué va el libro y cuál es su papel, por ejemplo, en la sociedad y todo eso. Vamos a verlo.
Hi, you asked what makes my book, Close to Holmes, different from the other guides that do indeed exist that also try to give people insight into the London of Sherlock Holmes. Well, it's very simple. Most guides that I've read focus very much on Sherlock Holmes, as you might expect. Very few people have actually focused on locations in London that have a connection to Arthur Conan Doyle. And even fewer have actually bothered to look where there are areas in London common to both the creation and the creator. So that is where my book is different from many others, in that I give roughly 50% of the book to both Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle. Give you a background into locations important to both the character and his creator, and also look at those locations in London that have relevance for both. How do I feel about writing a guide to a city that is constantly changing? Well, this is always a challenge. You write about a city that still exists, in this instance London, and of course you are writing about a particular point in time. I wrote that book during 2008 in the main, and it was published at the beginning of 2009. And there may well be things I talk about in the book that no longer exist in the London of 2014, 2015. However, the guide is still valuable because it provides a perspective on not only Victorian London, but the London of the year in which I wrote it, which is still a valuable historical document. And I realise that sounds quite conceited. But what I mean is that anyone reading my book 5, 10, 15 years from now will get an insight not only into the London of Sherlock Holmes, but also an idea into the London of 2008, when I was writing the book, and an insight into what was there in 2008 that might not be there at the point when someone picks up this book in the future. So you are getting 2 moments in time, as it were, a look at the London of Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle as they knew it in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but also a look from the perspective of a Sherlockian and Doylean as to how that London is different in 2008. The Sherlock Holmes pub, which features in my book, is very much the spiritual home of sort of conventional Sherlockians, if I may term them that. The Sherlock Holmes fans who are first and foremost fans of the Victorian Sherlock Holmes. Speedy's Cafe that you mentioned is very much, I think, the spiritual home of fans of BBC Sherlock. You frequently hear about meetings of fans of that show taking place at Speedy's Cafe. But for more traditional Sherlockians, the Sherlock Holmes pub is the place in London to be the spiritual home. This is because, primarily, it contains a great many exhibits from the 1951 Festival of Britain, in which there was a complete mock-up of the 221B sitting room constructed on Baker Street. And after that exhibition came to an end, the sizable chunk of the elements of that exhibition found their way to the Sherlock Holmes pub. On the first floor of that pub, there is a mock-up of the 221B sitting room with various aspects that anyone familiar with the original stories will recognise. And on the ground floor, there are various elements along the walls, from pictures, ornaments, postcards, etc., also from that exhibition, which sort of underscore its connection to Sherlock Holmes. And it was in the aftermath of the 1951 Festival of Britain that the present Sherlock Holmes Society of London was formed, because the sheer level of interest in Sherlock Holmes that was discovered when that exhibition was put on made it quite plain to various people that a society, if founded, would do well. The previous Sherlock Holmes Society, which had been founded in the 1930s, had been suspended at the beginning of the Second World War and had not reformed at the conclusion of the war. So there had been this period in London where there were no Sherlock Holmes societies at all. So that is another reason why the Sherlock Holmes pub is significant, because it very much is the home of the modern-day Sherlock Holmes Society of London, and it contains exhibits that are responsible for that society coming into being, albeit indirectly. Staying with the Sherlock Holmes pub, you mentioned a connection with a missing boot. Now this refers to the fact that there are some people who believe the Sherlock Holmes pub, which was formerly sort of a limited hotel, was the model for the Northumberland Hotel featured in The Hound of the Baskervilles, in which Sir Henry famously lost one of his boots. Personally, I don't subscribe to this theory. I think that Sherlock Holmes pub is in completely the wrong place if you read the story, and I think the hotels around Trafalgar Square, one of which doesn't exist anymore, or two actually, I stand corrected, they are better candidates. But I'm deviating from the point. The Sherlock Holmes pub itself claims a link to the story of the Noble Bachelor. Again, I think this is tenuous. There are better candidates for that hotel. You ask about Bradshaw's. Now, Bradshaw's is basically a UK national railway guide. Prior to the existence of the Bradshaw's Guide, there was no single volume in which you could look at timetables for all the train companies in the UK. And the Bradshaw's Guide was the first to put all the timetables for all the train companies and lines within the United Kingdom into a single volume. And it was much more than that. It was also something of a tourist guide, and a tourist guide aimed at citizens of the UK. Because we're talking about a time when UK citizens barely travelled within the United Kingdom, let alone further afield. So it was a handy guide that told travellers within the United Kingdom places of interest, places where they could stay, and gave you sort of census-style information like population counts of villages and when stations were built and so on. And such a guide as this was invaluable to Sherlock Holmes because it enabled him to travel from London to almost anywhere efficiently in order to investigate cases that occasionally took him outside of London, such as The Hound of the Baskervilles. But it was also very useful for journeys within London because it naturally carried train times in connection with the underground, timetables like that. So it was very important for him to navigate his way across London. Although Sherlock Holmes being Sherlock Holmes, you would imagine he probably knew many of those times from memory. You asked about my book covering an area of South East London called Crystal Palace. This is very important to the fan of Arthur Conan Doyle. Between 1891 and 1894 he lived in a road called Tennyson Road at number 12, and the house in which he lived still exists, and it is where a blue plaque commemorating his time living there and also his fame as the writer of Sherlock Holmes is situated to tell people who pass by. 12 Tennyson Road is an extremely important address in the life of Arthur Conan Doyle. it was during his time living there that he truly became internationally famous as the writer of Sherlock Holmes. It is where he wrote the bulk of the first 2 series of short stories, and it's also the house in which he penned the final problem in which Professor Moriarty and Sherlock Holmes had their fateful meeting at the Reichenbach Falls. But people tend to be quite unaware of these facts about Conan Doyle for the simple reason they're more interested in Sherlock Holmes than they are in his creator. But this house is incredibly significant. This was where Conan Doyle first attempted to send Sherlock Holmes to his permanent death. It is also where his wife was at the time she was diagnosed with incurable tuberculosis. Regrettably, internally the house has been completely gutted. There is nothing remaining there now of Conan Doyle's time. But externally it still looks very much as it was, apart from a rather shocking attempt at painting it completely white, or at least that is how it was the last time I saw it. But it's a very, very important area of South East London, as it's also where, in the general vicinity, where parts of the sign of 4%, which is one of the reasons why I give it so much coverage in my chapter called The Three Norwoods. It's very well worth a visit, even though it is some way out of central London. You asked about how I, as a person with a full-time job, managed to write books, and what advice I can give to people trying to do the same. Well, I mean, specifically you asked me about people writing novels. Now, of course, I have not written a novel. All of my books to date have been non-fiction pieces. But I don't think that's necessarily all that relevant. I think if you are trying to write a book at the same time as holding down a conventional day job, the single most important thing you can do is set aside a regular time to write. I don't think the duration you spend writing each day is important so much as making sure you write regularly. I think writing is like anything else. If you allow yourself to stop for too long a period, it can be difficult to get the momentum back again. So I think if you can allow yourself even as little as half an hour every day to write, to sit in front of a computer and write your book, just doing it regularly for short periods is more important than doing it occasionally for long periods. For me personally, I tend to write things during my lunch hour at work. I'm fortunate I work in IT, so I have a computer at my desk at work that has a word processor on it, so I'm able to load up my book file and work on it during my lunch hour, and I'm perfectly happy to do so. And that way I get sort of a minimum of 5 hours a week of book writing done. Outside of the time when I'm working on the computer, I always make sure I carry a notebook so that if I have an idea or I come across a piece of useful research, I can write it down immediately so it's not lost. If I have a moment of inspiration, I make sure I write it down. That way, when I come to my dedicated writing slot, I have my notebook of things I've uncovered since the last time I was writing, and I can type them up or not as I see fit. But the important thing is to keep regularly writing and not create too long a pause between episodes. I think that is the best advice I can give. How do I feel about my book being translated into Spanish? Well, of course, I'm very excited. It's the first time any of my books has made it into a language other than English. When I saw the proof copy, albeit soft copy, I was incredibly impressed with the work that had been done on it, particularly some of the areas where it radically differs from the original book. I mean, aside from the actual language, obviously there have been certain stylistic changes. So, yes, it's very, very exciting. I hope people in Spain who were not necessarily able to read the book in English are now able to do so. And I hope they enjoy it and come to London and get some use out of it. I mean, the great thing about the book is it's not purely a tourist guide. It's a book that's just as useful, while you're sitting in a comfortable chair at home reading. It's not a book that can only be used when you're on the ground in London. It's a book that you can reference at any time from anywhere. So I hope you all find it incredibly useful. And feedback, preferably positive, would be greatly appreciated. And if it helps to get the book translated into other languages as well, or indeed any of my other books translated into Spanish, I'll be incredibly pleased. And I'm very gratified that there was sufficient demand in Spain for a translation to be deemed worthwhile. So thank you very much, people of Spain. You asked me about Undershaw, Arthur Conan Doyle's home for 10 years in Surrey. I mean, the background is that he moved into the home in 1897. He had it built according to his own design, and he lived there until 1907, sort of a little over a year after the death of his first wife. It was a hotel for many years afterwards, and ceased being a hotel in around 2004-2005. From that date until now, it has stood empty and has suffered a certain amount of deterioration through vandalism and sort of the forces of nature. It was purchased by a company that sought to redevelop it and have it converted into a series of individual dwellings that would have seen the house sort of irrevocably partitioned. The Undershaw Preservation Trust was an organisation founded to oppose this, and I became a supporter of that organisation. Proceeds from my most recent book, An Entirely New Country, or 50% of those proceeds, go towards that campaign. And I very much hope it will be saved. Quite recently, the plans that would have seen it converted were quashed in the High Court in London. The planning permission to carve up the house was essentially revoked, and the people who owned the house decided to sell it on. And eventually, quite recently, it was purchased by a school who provide teaching facilities for children suffering from conditions like autism and Asperger's, I believe. And they have put forward some plans for the building. These plans are not enjoying universal acceptance, and the Undershaw Preservation Trust, English Heritage, the Victorian Society and other groups have registered objections to the plans as they currently stand, because they believe that these plans are not sort of respectful to the house's history and would damage it irrevocably. Other people, particularly local people, are quite supportive of the plan. So there's quite a sort of a loggerhead situation at the moment, where we have two very, very polarised camps, those that are really, really pro the plans of this school and those that are really, really anti the plans of the school. My personal position is that I have no problem with a school being in the building, but I'm not entirely happy with the plans that are currently on the table as I understand them. My hope is that the two sides can meet somewhere in the middle, so that this school can get off the ground, but at the same time preserve as much of Conan Doyle's former home as is possible. I don't believe the current plans do that, but I don't believe they are far away from being in a place where they could happily accommodate both the school and our literary heritage. So yes, I remain positive that a way forward can be found if people are just willing to bend a bit on both sides. At the moment, I don't see much signs of any bending on either side, but sort of fingers crossed we get there. You ask about my involvement with the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. Well, I joined them in 2007 and have been a full-time member ever since. But for the first 2 years I was a member, I didn't attend anything in the way of actual events. I was just content to sort of receive the journal that the Society produces. But in 2009 I attended my first actual event of the Society and have been doing so sort of fairly regularly ever since. In 2012, I was elected to the Society's council, its governing body, as it were, which is a group of some 12 or so members who run the Society on a day-to-day basis. Half of that 12 sort of hold dedicated positions within the Society, like a chairman, treasurer, editor of the Society's journal, etc. The other 6 positions are sort of general council positions that have no specific duties, but the people attend council meetings, vote on decisions, influence policy, and so on. And it was one of those kind of positions that I've occupied for the last 3 years, or nearly 3 years. It was my initial idea for the recent Stoddart dinner that took place at the Langham Hotel. I mean, that idea was ultimately taken forward by many people, but I originally conceived the idea and then others helped me build on it. And I regard that as my biggest contribution during my 3-year tenure on the Society's council. Positions like mine can only be occupied for 1 3-year period at a time. So in May of 2015, I will be standing down from my position on the council so that someone else can be elected in my place. Other than that, as a regular member, I've contributed articles to the Society Journal. I've provided a certain amount of advice when it comes to the Society's web presence, although not a great deal of late. But otherwise, I'm just content as a regular member to attend events and enjoy all the things the Society offers. And if you are a member of the Society and you find yourself in London, before coming over, do try and see if the Society is doing anything you can attend, because I feel pretty confident you will enjoy attending a meeting. It's all very well and good being a member of the Society at a distance, but I think you get much more out of the Society if you're able to physically turn up and take part in things. So if you're not a member, do become one, and when you get an opportunity, do come and see us in London and join in. We'd love to meet you.